So, so Alex, I think what you're deeming as normal and casual isn't normal and casual for everybody here. And I got to say, it's a real pleasure to kind of watch you kind of go through these things. One thing that really became apparent as you were speaking today was the amount of energy, thought, planning, and care that went into each of your climbs over time.
Well, some more than others, which is kind of the point, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Maybe help us understand that. How do you envision a climb? How does that even, like, what are you seeing in your mind? How does that come together?
Well, I don't know. I mean, so there are kind of two components to that, I guess. There's the physical side of it, the reality of what I will have to do. So part of what I think about are the nuts and bolts of where do I put my hands, where do I put my feet, how does my body move, remembering what the climb looks like and how it'll feel. Mm-hmm. But then, maybe the harder side, the more nebulous side of it, the part that's harder to put your finger on, is the mental side of it, actually believing that it might be possible. And that's kind of why I went into such depth right now with El Cap, is that it really took this long, long journey to get to the point where I thought that something like that might be possible. And it's, I couldn't say that, like, if you do those climbs, one day El Cap will look reasonable to you. But for whatever reason, for me, at the end of this very long path, and that's a tiny fraction of the actual path, I've done something like 35 free solos that haven't been repeated, things that were first free solos or challenges. Like, I think I've done 3 or 4 in Squamish actually that haven't been repeated, and all of those were small steps toward eventually being able to look at El Cap and think that it might be possible. I don't even remember the question. I'm just rambling. Sorry, guys.
Hey, this is great. And I think I'm a father of 3 little monsters, 4, 6, and 8. And I think there's got to be a pretty amazing story in terms of how your mother and your family supported you through all of that. What tips do you have for parents that could support? How did she nurture and encourage you to pursue such an incredible dream, such a passion?
Yeah. So I mean, that's an interesting question. So. I mean, really, it's all, for me, it was laissez-faire parenting, like benign neglect, however you want to frame it, but basically
there
parents
goes
that
Alex.
Didn't really...
Get off the wall, Alex.
Well, no, not even that, just like, oh, were you climbing today? That sounds nice. I hope you had fun. That kind of parenting.
Police called again, Alex.
No, not even. I mean, because I never got in any trouble. I got good grades. Everything was good. But, I mean, actually, so my father was the one who took me to the climbing gym and belayed me for literally years. I mean, like a little league dad or something. He would go in, and it was like a running joke at the climbing gym that when he was holding the rope for me, the rope would be running, like a loop of slack would run from the ground to the wall and then up. And I would go up and down, up and down, up and down for hours. And my dad would just pull the rope in, feed the rope out, pull the rope in, and just totally chill. But he wasn't a climber. He would climb a little bit just so that I could rest in between climbs. He would play around since he was at the climbing gym, but he didn't really care. He was a professor and he was just there to support me. And my mother actually didn't know anything about climbing. Had never been to the gym with me. Didn't know anything about it until I was 19. I was at Youth Nationals, and so she came. Nationals was in Sacramento that year, where I was from. And so, obviously she came to the competition and be like, oh, what's this all about? Like, what have you spent the last 8 years doing? And so. And then once I started going on the road and climbing outside, so my father actually died the next year, which is part of the reason I dropped out of school and went climbing more, and it's all complicated. But then, then mom was just kind of like, oh, I hope you're having fun, but she didn't really know what I was doing because I'm just out in the mountains doing my thing. She's like, be safe, have fun, pretty unstressed. She was kind of focused on her own stuff.
Gotcha.
But yeah, anyway, all that to say, if you ignore your kids for the next 15 years, they'll probably wind up pretty adventurous.
So you're a strong proponent of nature. Oh, that's good to know. Thank God.
I am a strong proponent of nature. Though, interestingly, I grew up in the suburbs, and the bulk of my nature was actually just biking along this bike path to get to the climbing gym. Yeah. And so, I was outdoors, I was cycling a lot, but I definitely wasn't in the mountains. I wasn't in beautiful, alpine lakes or anything. I was just going climbing indoors. But.
Gotcha. And over, a lot of your identity right now is a lot's woven into this notion of free soloing. But one of the things as we started learning more about you, it seems like you've done a lot more really interesting types of adventures. Is there any other kind of adventures that you'd like to call attention to that were really challenging, really meaningful to you? Maybe some of the really longer treks? Because it seems like there's a little bit more to you than just the free solo stuff.
For sure. I mean, I spend almost all my time talking about free soloing just because there's the film about free soloing and people are interested in it. And I can understand why people are curious about it because it is so, the consequences are so high and it does seem very niche, But even if I didn't free solo, I'd probably still be a professional climber just from all the expeditions I've been on and, the speed climbing that I do and the other types of climbing that I do. Yep. And yeah, I mean, honestly, if I spent all my time talking about that, I'd be just as happy. Like, went on an expedition to Antarctica last year, and it was a truly remarkable adventure. We climbed a bunch of new routes on spires that had never been climbed before, and basically we brought Yosemite-style speed climbing to, these peaks in Antarctica. And so it was kind of this new way of climbing some of these mountains, and it was awesome. I've had a ton of adventures like that, but I never really get to talk about them that much because everyone wants to hear about death.
We don't need to talk about that. Well, do you want to dig into any of them? Or is there any that you're just like, hey, you know what, here's a great example of where I hit this kind of really immeasurable wall and how I got through it? Or are there any that come to mind?
I don't know. I mean, actually, I often think about expeditions and adventure travel and things like that more in relation to my foundation and the work that we've been trying to do, partially because many of the trips have been specifically for the foundation, expeditions in various parts of the world for a foundation project. But also just because I think that in a more general sense, I care more about the world because I've been to so many places, as a climber visiting. I mean, specifically in 2009, I went on an expedition to Chad to climb in the northeastern corner of Chad, kind of by the border of Sudan and Libya. It's like basically the grimmest place on earth. I mean, by pretty much any measure. It's crazy. But so it was my first trip to Africa, and it's just, I mean, I don't even really know how to describe it. I mean, we were driving for 3 days across open desert with no roads, no anything, just driving by GPS across flat sand toward this remote corner of Chad. And then, I mean, there were just so many crazy experiences on that trip. I mean, the climbing was terrible, which is kind of the nature of exploratory first ascent climbing, is that often the rock is not really rock. In this case, it felt like bags of sand, where it felt solid on the outside, but if you poked a hole in it, then sand would just come out, and you're like, oh no. So basically it meant that you couldn't drill protection bolts, you couldn't really protect yourself while you were climbing, because the rock would just explode around you. Anyway, but so adventures like that. So some of the takeaways from that trip, I mean, I had a few moments on that trip in Chad. It's the most inhospitable place I've ever been, where like the grass was really, really pointy. There were goat heads everywhere, like little prickly thorns that would, like the flip-flops that I wore on that trip, I wore them for about 7 or 8 years afterward until they finally died. But the whole bottom was just full of goat heads, and as I wore the sandals down over time, the goat heads would poke through the bottom and poke my toes. Every couple months, I'd be like, oh, another one just worked its way through the sole of my sandal. I mean, it was crazy. But so then there were a handful of local folks that lived there, and you see these little kids just running around in the grass barefoot. And I was like, how can anybody live here barefoot? I was like, this is crazy. Like, I can't even walk around in my shoes because it's so pokey and so inhospitable and so dry. And so some of these kids, they'd be herding their goats, and they would watch us climb because obviously, it's the most bizarre thing that's ever happened in their life probably to have a couple of jeeps full of tourists show up and climb on these spires. And so they would show up and they were all in their robes, kind of hunkered down from the sun, and they'd have no food or water, and they would just hunker down and they would watch for 8 hours, like the whole day of us climbing, and then they would leave again. And it occurred to us that at no point did we ever see them eat or drink. We're just like, man, this is pretty grim. It's like it's a hard living. And so I don't know. I mean, I don't even know why I'm rambling about this, but basically a bunch of experiences like that sort of began to inform the work of the foundation.
Yeah. I want to get into the foundation in a moment, but one of the things that really resonated with me the first time I watched Free Solo, Michelle and I watched it together. And
did you show the kids?
We've not shown the kids, actually,
well.
but I think we should show the kids, and we will, I promise. This is my onus to you. Our 4-year-old Shay, maybe, who knows, she'll be the climber. Probably her son, Luke, but or Bria, the really risk-intolerant one. So that actually brings me to this interesting conversation we had, which is, wow, like it's going to be really interesting to meet Alex, and I wonder, is he going to have this completely different risk profile? So in watching the film, one of my net conclusions was, wow, he has a different scope of risk. So and you talk quite casually around the kind of the determination. Just before, when we were doing a little bit of a briefing conversation, we talked about the dangers of mountain biking. And you told me, like, no way, that's too dangerous. The likelihood of hurting yourself is like so significant. It's like every time you go mountain biking, there's a likelihood you will get hurt. And I was kind of sitting there thinking, oh, I've never really thought of it that way, Alex. I thought you were more of a risk taker than I am. So let's talk about risk.
Yeah, no, so actually
really
I
cool
think
topic.
this is a great way to, so I think there's an important differentiation between risk and consequence. And so mountain biking, climbing comparison is a great way to illustrate that. So everybody thinks of climbing as very risky, but the likelihood of an accident in climbing is actually not really that high, but the consequences of an accident are extremely high, meaning that when you have an accident climbing, people typically die, but accidents happen really infrequently. Whereas with mountain biking, the risk of injury is extremely high. I mean, pretty much every time you ride, you fall off your bike, at least the way I ride. I'm not that good on a bicycle. Or I mean, for skiing also. I mean, basically any gravity-assisted sport, your risk of crashing is pretty high, but the consequences are relatively mild. You know, I mean, you may break a bone, but it's generally unlikely that you're going to die. I mean, it's hard to die mountain biking. It's like you can, but it's not common.
Probably have to fall off a cliff.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course you can, but it's not common. You'll frequently break your arm, you'll break your collarbone, you'll dislocate your shoulder, like all kinds of things will happen mountain biking, but it's rare that you die. And so it's kind of the opposite risk profile from climbing. And I actually kind of prefer the climbing end of the spectrum, where it's, accidents are very infrequent, but when they happen, they're serious. Just because for whatever reason, I find that easier to manage. I prefer a sport where you just pay attention all the time because the consequences are high.
It also.
I mean, and actually, I think that's because I kind of like being in control. I like focusing, trying hard, and making sure that I don't have an accident. And the whole nature of mountain biking, I mean, the fun part is when you're right on the edge of control. And, that's why I don't really love gravity sports that much.
That's true, because you have this kind of variable of speed, which obviously, and then of course surface conditions, what you really can't detect. I guess that would be one way.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on in mountain biking. You don't really know what's coming next, and then all of a sudden you break your clavicle, and you're like, oh. And all your friends are like, oh, of course, I broke my clavicle last season. That happens every year. And you're like, why do you mountain bike? That's dumb.
I can totally follow this. So then you to reduce the risk of mechanical failure, you get rid of all things that are mechanical.
That is so true.
So it's less risky to free solo. Hey, following suit though, one of the things you covered off was it seems like you have a really heightened awareness of what you're designed for, right? So just even again sitting here listening to you, watching the film, it just seems, wow, this is somebody that really knows. It's not even about your why. You actually know what you would be amazing at and what you really enjoy. And you used the word amazing, and you talked about how each climb you're working towards almost making them better, more satisfying, and you've narrowed in on this really interesting vector that helps you to understand what you love. You also mentioned the fact that you record all your climbs. So as you go through that book, that journal of climbs, what are you looking for? How has that helped you figure out more of what you love? How do you kind of turn up the good and turn down the bad?
I don't know. I mean, honestly, I'm not totally sure. I mean, typically when I read through my old journals, the thing that I'm most struck by is I'm always like, I can't believe I climbed that much. I always look back and I'm like, oh, that is a lot of climbing. I can't believe I was in one place climbing this, and then the next day I was in some other city climbing this, and then I was at something, and I'm always like, I just cannot believe that I was climbing that much. But, I don't know. So in my climbing journals, I always used to make tons of notes, for things that I failed on, like learn better footwork or practice your technique, or particularly the alpine. Actually, the photos that I showed you from Patagonia of the big mountains, those climbs in particular, I had tons and tons of notes with, how I should have done my layering better, how I should have taken different equipment, how I could have eaten better throughout the climb to maintain better energy, things like that. Basically there's a lot to learn with alpinism because there's so many intricate systems. And so I guess part of the journal has always been to improve. But that said, over the 15 years that I've kept a journal, I'm no longer writing so many work on your footwork type notes because realistically I've put 15 years of work into it. My footwork's just not getting that much better anymore. I don't want to say that it couldn't, but it's just, diminishing returns to some extent. You put a lot of effort into certain things. It's just hard to imagine getting that much better at it. I don't know. I mean,
No, you clearly do know, which is what's so awesome about this conversation. There's a really interesting book. It's called The Why Engine. And the Why Engine, for those of you who have a chance to take a look, it basically talks about the 7 whys for people to understand kind of what it is that what they're almost like their hidden purpose is. And the one that resonates the most for me as I'm talking to you, and who knows if this is what you think, but is always improving, never satisfied. It seems like you have this kind of continuous focus on improvement. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I feel like we need a sofa here so I can lay down and it's like full therapy style. I'm like, no, I mean, there are a lot of problems in childhood and I need to keep improving.
As a CEO, that is my job, really, actually. I'm pretty much
Is that what CEOs do?
It's the chief whooping person. It really is the CEO role. This seems like, I'd love to we will definitely bring Dory and Michelle out. But before we get into the foundation and a lot of what that's doing, I'd love you to tell us the story of why. Why did you start a foundation, and what was the intention? Why did you even gravitate towards energy as a focus for the impact you want?
Well, okay, so taking that question in the two strides. So I mean, why did I start a foundation? Honestly, I don't have a great answer for it. I mean, besides a general, I've always felt a certain obligation to do something useful, to do something positive in the world. And some of that comes, prepare yourself, this will be a slightly rambly answer, because I just don't have a great reason for it. But part of that comes from my sister, actually. I have an older sister who's maybe the most intentional person I know. She's very kind and thoughtful and uses her time, intentionally. And she lives in Portland. She was a public school teacher, and so she's like an episode of Portlandia. She's vegan. She only rides a bicycle. She's she's never owned a car. And so I always looked at her as this example of a very a good way to lead a life and a way that has a lot of positive impact on the world. And so in Dory's introduction, she was talking about me living in the van and donating a third of my income, and I mean that's true. But the years that I started the foundation, I actually did a couple of my first commercial gigs. I mean, you saw some photos in my slideshow of doing a TV commercial. And for whatever reason, society really overvalues sports and entertainment in a way that it doesn't value education and other things that are actually quite a bit more useful. And so my sister is barely making a living as a public school teacher, and I could do a one-day commercial shoot and make double or triple her salary in a day. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, this isn't fair. This doesn't reflect the right values. This isn't the way that the world should be working. And yet, I can't just donate that money to the federal government. And particularly right now, I mean, when I look at what the federal government's doing, I'm sort of like, I can't really trust political leadership to make the world a better place because they're so often not doing that. And so, basically donating to the charities that, basically I felt like I should start directing my money in a more intentional way. And so, I felt like I would start a foundation and start giving to nonprofits that I supported. And obviously I cared about the environment because I'm living outdoors all the time. I've been reading a ton of environmental nonfiction. I was personally concerned about climate change and, some of the trends, some of the things facing the world. And so I was like, okay, I'm donating to environmental nonprofits. But then I felt like if I'm doing that, they may as well also be improving standard of living. I mean, they should help the human populations near the projects. Mostly because, I mean, through my travels, I've sort of had been exposed to the fact that communities will cut down their last tree if it means, gathering wood to boil water to feed their family. I mean, people don't care about environmental protection if they're living in poverty. That's just the way it is. And so there's no real point in trying to protect the environment if it doesn't also help people in poverty or help, communities nearby. And so, I was looking for projects that married those two goals, and that always led me to solar. And so after 5 or 6 years of supporting solar projects, we just explicitly made it the mission of the foundation, because at some point it felt like we needed the focus. But really it just came down to me looking for projects that did the most good in a way that made sense to me.
That's awesome. Well, with that, let's bring Dory and Michelle out here and bring them into the fold from a conversation perspective. And
cool.
And I think you're supposed to go there, and I'm going to go.
Yes,
there.
sir.
Little musical chairs.
So, Dory, Michelle, as you were sitting behind there, you're like, oh God, Greg is totally missing the mark on the questions here. What should we be, Alex is in this wonderful hot seat, but maybe we give him control of the battle. Alex, what questions do you have for us? Yeah.
Oh, I don't even know where to start. I'm like, oh no. I mean, I don't know. Honestly, these questions of why and purpose and what drives you, I mean, in a lot of ways, those have always been the hardest questions for me to answer and the hardest to understand because, I mean, I feel like a lot of what I've done in life have felt slightly compelled for. I mean, certainly the foundation, I feel certain moral obligation, like I just have to, it's fair. Like that is the way the world should be. I'm obligated to do that. But I don't know, I mean, is that how you guys have felt about it? Is that how Traction for Good works? I mean, I don't know, basically. It's hard to answer those questions.
What do you think, Mish?
Well, there seemed to be an interesting parallel in terms of how you started. You felt, you earned that income, and you said, there's something that doesn't quite feel right. And that was one of the founding aspects of Traction for Good. Greg, for his business, he received it was a $23,000 referral fee check. And I wasn't working at Traction at the time. I was on mat leave with our first. And, he said, I have this check. He didn't really know what to do. He's like, I don't feel right accepting this. This isn't money that I earned. It's something that, I've referred this technology because it's the right thing, not because I get this referral fee. And so he said, what should I do with it? And my answer was, let's give it away. And that was actually the first Traction for Good budget, is finding a way that we can make good with that money. So it's an interesting parallel in terms of how things started.
I mean, yeah, that is exactly what happened at the foundation. I was just sort of like, because it actually is quite fun shooting commercials. You're like, oh, you get the whole Hollywood experience. You're like, this is cool. There's like a helicopter filming, and you're like, oh, I feel like Tom Cruise. This is totally badass. Like, it's cool. Like, it's fun work. But then you start getting all the checks, and you're like, I feel slightly dirty. And it just feels, and like I said, it feels grossly unfair when I look. Both my parents were community college professors, and my sister's a public school teacher, and my whole family has always been in education. And nobody cares about education. Nobody pays teachers, and I'm like, unfortunately, I'm not able to donate direct. I mean, I guess I could find educational nonprofits, but basically, I just don't feel like I can change society in the ways that I think are meaningful directly. Like, it's just not an easy thing for one individual to do. But I felt like with the environmental issues that are facing the world, there was a bigger potential for an individual to do something useful, and so that's where we went.
And Dory, you two were just in Puerto Rico working on a project, so I'd love to hear just a little bit more about what you did in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, totally. Puerto Rico was awesome, although Alex thought it was a little bit disgusting and sweaty there, which is not false.
It's too humid.
It's very humid.
It's really humid for climbing. But the community was lovely. The project
That
was
sounds like a
amazing.
new challenge,
But
Alex.
the climbing was very sweaty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're working in Puerto Rico. We just started working with this incredible nonprofit there who, something that I always think about is like, we like to work with organizations where like it's a privilege to support them. Like it's like a true honor to be able to advance their work. And the group we work with there totally falls into that category. They're called Casa Pueblo, and they've been doing this like incredible environmental activism work for 40 years. And when Hurricane Maria came through last year, Casa Pueblo's been on solar for years, which is like pretty revolutionary in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, since the 90s, huh?
Yeah, since the 90s for a long time.
Like since before solar was even any good. And
Totally.
They were still on solar.
Yeah, they were like doing it for the principle of the thing, truly.
Exactly.
And after Hurricane Maria, all the lights went out in the entire province of Adjuntas, except for places like Casa Pueblo, and they became energy oases. And so everybody in those communities has this like deep understanding of why it's really powerful to use solar energy. And we're helping Casa Pueblo develop the island's first cooperative solar microgrid. And it's really their work. We're just there to back them up. But I think like, circling back on this whole like trying to rebalance the scales and like make things a little bit more fair or a little bit more just. It's like Casa Pueblo doesn't have access to the kind of resources that we do. And showing up and giving them the tools to do this work that like they know how to do. They just need like a little bit of gasoline, no pun intended in this context, to fire it. It's cool to be able to support that.
Hey, I want to pick up on that. A little while ago, we were having an internal conversation around diversity and inclusion. And one of the gentlemen, Christopher Bruzzi from Traction, he lives out on the East Coast. He sent me actually a really cool video. And it was, and we'll circulate it actually to all of you so you guys can have an opportunity to see this. But the general thesis of it was, it's not necessarily about kind of a continued subsidy, but it's about leveling the playing field so everyone has a fair shot. Right? And so where we're born, the families that we're born into, the places that we're born are going to have some determinant path on whether or not we'll be successful or not. And it's actually, what the challenge is, it's actually removing the opportunity for people to thrive. Right? They'll never have a chance to win the race because they're so far behind. As I talk about that, what other countries or places do you think we need to be more focused on Alex and Dory?
No, you take it.
I mean, we work a lot in indigenous communities, and like obviously any place in the Americas, there are First Nations or Native communities who, you know, for a pretty long time have been getting a pretty short end of the stick. And so doing a little bit of resource allocation and of thinking it from a perspective of equity, not equality, right? Not giving everybody the same thing, but giving them the right thing, the thing that balances it out. I think is a really powerful way of looking at stuff. So since long before I was with the foundation, we've been working in the Navajo Nation, supporting some solar energy projects there, and we're expanding the work that we're funding in Native communities in the States. But I think that's a really powerful place to allocate resources, no matter where you live. And those communities are, they're intermingled, right, with everybody else, and like being able to provide some support there can be really powerful.
And the one other thing too is it's often the empowerment of the people that you're serving. So often, you know, people that need support don't want charity, right? They want actually a hand up, right? Not necessarily a handout. And we talked about actually this last night. This came up. Sometimes when we give away free work, free isn't always valued, right? There's no buy-in. If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. There's no signed contract. You just keep coming back. And it's like, well, there has to be that buy-in. And it was the same thing for you, how you felt. Or you can build a school, but if you just kind of go in there and build a school, it's not going to be appreciated because they didn't put some sweat equity into that school.
Well, and if you just go and build a school, it often winds up being a barn for people's goats. You know,
Right.
if there isn't a teacher, and I've actually seen this exactly in Chad, is that there are all these beautiful schools that were built with EU funding, but then, you know, people are just using them as barn for their animals because there are no teachers paid for, and there's no salary. So you're sort of like, oh, you know, there's this beautiful structure, but it just gets used by the community in whatever way they need, you know, but whatever way they can. Because they're kind of like, oh, somebody built this structure, you know, but there's no teacher, so we'll just use it how we can.
There was
And I
the
mean,
example of the mosquito nets. You
Yeah,
can-
totally. Which is like a classic development narrative of like this organization was like, we're going to give everybody mosquito nets. It's going to eliminate malaria. It's going to change everything in this community in sub-Saharan Africa. And all the mosquito nets were free, and they distributed them, and people used them to fish. Because a mosquito net looks like a fishing net. And there was no education, and nobody asked for them, and it did nothing to affect the prevalence of malaria. And I
but
think
they caught a lot of fish.
they
probably.
caught a lot of fish. But I mean, that's good, right? Like they were
Develop a
doing
different
what
problem.
they needed to.
Well, and that's, I mean, honestly, I think that's always informed our work at the foundation is kind of
sure.
trusting people to do what's best for themselves. And that's one of the things that I've always loved about solar projects is that I feel like energy access is a really basic way to help people do what's best for themselves. I mean, when people are able to light their home after dark, they can use that time in whatever way is best for them. Maybe that's for entertainment, maybe that's for reading, maybe that's for studying, maybe that's for tidying up their kitchen, you know, whatever. But basically, you know, trusting people to do what's best for themselves, I think is important.
Energy gives them leverage, right? It gives them leverage to produce food. It gives them leverage to be better informed and educated. It gives them leverage, mechanical advantage in so many different areas. You're right now in this limelight, right? So Free Solo, you know, incredible film, and at a time where I think the world's looking for heroes in a lot of ways, and I think a lot of people are finding you to be a hero, and it's the quiet, humble heroes that we seek. I'm interested also, you know, as the limelight's on you, you're also, it seems like you're not going at this alone. And I mentioned in my keynote, I found a little relationship that you guys are obviously building with Rivian. And traditionally we've seen nonprofits really siloed, trying to help and then competing. Can you explain a little bit about the relationship that you're building with Rivian and why and how that's coming together for you?
Well, I mean, when you talk about relationships and silos with the foundation, I mean, one of our guiding principles with the Honnold Foundation has always just been to do the most good possible. I've never really cared if our name is on it or if, you know, who we partner with or how it happens, as long as it does something useful in the world. I mean, because really I started the foundation because I want to sleep better at night. You know, I was like, I want to know that something good is happening. So it doesn't totally matter if anyone else knows or if, you know, how it all comes about, as long as something useful actually happens. And I think as long as that's kind of at the core of what we do, you know, focusing on the projects, focusing on the results, you know, not really caring so much about,
But I mean, I think the sort of like secret sauce that we have obviously is like Alex. Like we're not like a normal small foundation because we have this huge spotlight that we can point at things that we think deserve attention. And so when we think about like partnerships with other brands in the outdoor industry or like, you know, we're working with some solar companies, like we have this opportunity to broker all these relationships and connect the dots. And like I always joke about like leveraging fame for the forces of good, but like that's really what it is. It's like people are excited about getting involved, and that gives us the opportunity to bring people into projects that they wouldn't be connected to otherwise, and tell these like really big, beautiful, engaging stories that people are more likely to watch because it's a story that has Alex in it.
Yeah, though just to keep it in perspective, when you say that people need heroes and whatever, I mean, so Free Solo made something like $20 million in the box office, which is pretty big for a documentary. The latest Avengers movies made $3 billion in the last week and a half, and you're sort of like, oh, I mean, I think most people prefer their heroes to be big and green and strong. And, I'm just saying, I mean, Free Solo, like, yeah, it's pretty big for a documentary. It's not Marvel, But anyway.
Well, maybe along those lines, you've obviously made a pretty conscious choice to put yourself, out there, right? Why did you do that?
Well, what do you mean by out there? You mean being the subject of the film?
Even doing the
and things
film,
like
like taking something that you love, taking what really is the ultimate hobby, and you made that into work. And I was always taught, hey, look, never make your hobby your work, because you'll learn to hate your hobby.
No, and now you tell me, It's a little too late. Yeah. No, I mean, actually, that is a very fair question. It's a big question, and something that obviously I've thought about a lot, because I have a lot of friends who are really dark horse climbers, who are unsponsored climbers, who are very talented, very good at what they do, but for whatever reason, they don't respond to email, they don't return calls, and they don't get free climbing stuff. They're not in films. They just go climb all the time. And I've always known that those are kind of the two paths in climbing. I could have gone that way if I wanted, where I just keep focusing on the things that I love to do and just not say yes to any of the projects that I've been a part of. And ultimately, I felt, again, I mean, I guess an obligation to do what was best. And in this case, I just had this opportunity. I just kind of had to go down that path. I felt like the foundation has actually really helped me with that, because it gives me it gives me something to focus all that into. But even without the foundation, I mean, I probably would have taken that path anyway, just because, it's nice to be able to buy a home and to have a little more stability. Because the thing about being a professional climber is that it's, I mean, there's no security in it. There's no, many of my friends climb full-time until they're 45, 50, and then they're suddenly left in this position where they have no health insurance, they have no real job prospects, they have no, they don't even necessarily have a family or support structure. Like some of the legendary climbers from the 70s are now crowdfunding their cancer treatments and things like that, because they have no savings of any kind and no family, and you're just sort of like, I mean, that's grim, I mean, that's, like, I just don't want that to be me. I mean, that's a little dark, but, grim. But actually, so while I'm telling stories like that, though, so one of the other things that informed my whole decision behind the Honnold Foundation and was sort of relevant, you guys have probably never heard of a climber named Ron Kalk, but he was a legendary climber in the U.S. in the 70s and 80s, and he was Tom Cruise's stunt double in a bunch of different films. So he's very handsome, very dashing. He was sort of the golden child of American climbing, before I started climbing. And I did.
Don't worry. You're good. You're good.
You're good. Okay, that sounded douchey. What I meant was before I was born.
Get out of the hole. Get out of the hole.
Yeah.
You're fine.
No, so before I was born, and so Ron Kalk, though, so he still lives in Yosemite. He goes climbing all the time. I see him climbing at the cliff pretty frequently. He keeps a low profile. He climbs for himself. He has a great time. He runs this nonprofit called Sacred Rock that takes disadvantaged youth from local communities out backpacking in the woods in Yosemite. It's a really great way for some of the folks in some of the neighboring towns to experience nature, many of them for the first time in their lives. And so his nonprofit, Sacred Rock, is pretty small, pretty modest, and he started after he'd already retired from climbing. And I always looked at Ron, and I don't know what his goal with his foundation is, or what he really, I mean, I think that he personally just likes taking little groups of kids out and experiencing it. He's a major hippie. He loves to just go look at the river and just be like, oh, the flow of water on earth, So I think he just likes taking kids out and experiencing that. But I always kind of wondered what Sacred Rock could have been had he started it in his prime in the 70s and 80s, just because, even though at that point he was still focused on climbing, he could have allowed this side project to grow. And so that's a big part of what I've tried to do with the Honnold Foundation, was that even though, obviously I've been super focused on climbing. I mean, you look at Free Solo, you look at the project with El Cap. I mean, I've been focused on my climbing, but at the same time, I was aware that if I started the Honnold Foundation now, worked on the side, hired people much smarter than me to run it, I could let it blossom while I was in the peak of my climbing career, so that when I'm older and I want to focus all my attention on it, it actually is a thing that I can put that effort into. I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a rambling anecdote, but I mean, I just looked at some of these older climbers, and I was like, oh, I felt like they had an opportunity that they let go by, and I wanted to make sure that I seized mine.
I sense you want to ask a question. Yeah.
I do have a question, actually. Maybe for Dory and Alex, you guys made a choice to have all of your funding for the projects unrestricted. I don't know, for the nonprofits that are in the room, there's probably some, just because there's so much that, sometimes funders put on organizations and how, like, we know best, this is how you're going to spend the money. Just maybe talk about why you went through that.
Well, because we definitely don't know best.
Yeah.
We are always open to input.
But I mean, for real, I think that's
Yeah.
important. I think that funders often go into these interactions being like, I want this to go to direct services, because that's where it all happens. And when we were having this conversation about approaching it as unrestricted funding, I think that the fact that we don't think we know best is a really important part of it. Like, the reason why we're not just a solar energy access direct provider is because, like, we don't know how to do it in all these places. That's the whole point. Like, we're giving people to other money who already have the local knowledge to be successful. But I think the other piece of it is that I worked in nonprofits for years before coming to the Honnold Foundation, and I know what it's like to be like, we have this grant money, we have to spend half of it on someone to manage the grant and do all of the horrible reporting on the grant, and also we can't spend it on salary, and so everyone's underpaid, and we can't retain staff, and like, the people who end up suffering are the people you're trying to serve. And so it's really fun, honestly, to be able to say to organizations like, look, we trust you, like, we believe in your work, here is some money, spend it on paper clips or salary or direct services or whatever it is that you need, and like, tell us how it goes. And I think it's a good way to give people the tools.
I mean, in some ways, that's a real carryover from climbing, is only climbing with people that you trust, people that you want to spend time with. And I mean, basically, we only fund organizations that we trust, that we believe in them. And so then just give them the latitude they need. Like, let them do it the best way they can.
Amazing. Well, I think we're almost winding out of time, but we have about 3 minutes. And so what I'd love to do in the last 3 is maybe just kind of turn it free solo to the two of you, just to talk about, there's a group of people here that came to spend some time with you. You're clearly disappointed in the lack of use of the outdoors by them. So I feel like you should give them a couple basic tips on how to learn some basic fundamentals of climbing, because it is for everybody. And
So
maybe
you're saying I have
something
2.5 minutes to teach this crowd how to climb, and then we're all going to walk to the climbing gym together, and we're going to
If
test
you want to
it.
be taught how to climb, you may as well. No, but what recommendation? What do you want people? What do you want people to leave here with from this time that we've had together?
I mean, well, that's a heavy. I mean, I don't know. It's your party. You know?
Turn it on me.
You built the campfire. You
I
brought
did
us all
build-
out.
I
So
know.
you gotta.
I want them to all watch me lift this rock again.
I know. I'd love to hear more about, I mean, we've talked a lot about what you have done, even just kind of looking forward, if whether it's foundation related or climbing related, what it is that you aspire to do next. Is it the next climb, or is it now just kind of you're enjoying the process of climbing and you're focused on the foundation? What is it that's next?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly. I mean, so the last 6-7 months, like I said, I've been promoting the film so much, just touring nonstop with the film, and so it's really hard to have any kind of vision of climbing beyond that, because I'm just talking about El Cap all the time. But now that the film tour has simmered down, I've been climbing outdoors quite a bit more, and actually just in the last week, I've started to have a few little imaginings of like, little climbing goals that could be fun, could be inspiring. Though honestly, in the last couple months, I've probably drawn the most personal inspiration from the work we've been doing at the foundation. Like going to Puerto Rico, I mean, when I said I would go, I was sort of like, I'm obligated to go support this event, check out this project. But then it turned out it was actually energizing in a way that I was surprised by. It was really inspiring to see the people doing the work. It was inspiring to meet the people, the whole business cooperative, to see the people who are going to install the solar on their businesses in town. I mean, basically the whole thing about it, I was like, this is the way the world should work, And sometimes it's just uplifting to go and meet smart people doing good things in the world. And so I think that recently, I've been getting the most inspiration from the foundation projects. but I think in the not so distant future, it'll swing back towards climbing goals. And I've been I trained this morning in the climbing gym. I've been staying fit through the whole filming process, and so I really want to just go use that outdoors on something. I just don't quite know what yet. So I mean, we'll kind of see. But basically, I'm just plowing ahead on both fronts.
Amazing.
I'll do my
And
best.
my last question, would you ever consider becoming a Lyft driver? 'Cause I think you'd be really interesting.
No, I try not to speak in my Lyft rides. But no, I think my Lyft should drive itself.
Oh, there
I
you
cannot
go.
wait.
Well, for
Cannot
the
wait.
record, I've applied to become a Lyft driver. I'm aspiring to be the first CEO Lyft driver in Vancouver.
Because you have nothing else to do.
No.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Can you bring your kids? All right. Well, thank you very much, Alex.
Cool, thank you
Dory.
guys.
Have a great day.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. Very
Thanks so
appreciate
much,
it.
Dory.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks so much, Alex.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you guys. How's it going?